Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. We are now in Module 3, dealing with content from Chapter 3 of the textbook. The topics in this chapter of the textbook have to do with, on the one hand, business ownership, and the other hand, small business and entrepreneurship. So let's see if we can climb into the topic of business ownership right off the bat. As you can see from the title slide, the topic of this first lecture is simply to consider who owns the business and what are the implications of who owns the business and in what form. Because while this may seem like, well, some rather straightforward questions that you only handle at the very beginning when you first create your business, the implications and the consequences of the decisions you make are very far-reaching. So for instance, who owns the business and how? Well, some of the questions that will be answered by that: who puts money into the business? Who puts money in to start the business? And then who subsequently puts money in the second, the third, the fourth time around? As a result of that, who makes decisions in the business? And who manages the business on a day-to-day basis? All these things are answered as consequences of who owns the business and how do they own it. Consider also, when we ask the question, who owns the business and how, well, we're also going to be answering the question, who has the right to take the profits home? Remember our very first lecture, what are profits? Profits are revenues minus expenses. It's what the business has left over after paying all its costs. Who gets to take that home? And who has the right to make decisions? Who takes the profits home? The other side, of course, financially, who is legally responsible for the debts of the business? What happens when things go really bad? And what happens if the business gets sued by an outside party, by a disgruntled customer, by a competitor, by the government? Who's responsible? Who's legally liable for the consequences of a lawsuit? And finally, who owns the business and how? Well, that will help to answer questions like, what happens when the current owner or owners want to retire? What happens when we, as the founders, the ones who started the business and set the vision for the business, had a particular way of doing business and wanted the business to accomplish certain things? Well, how do we make sure the business continues to do all those things when we're no longer involved? In other words, this last set of questions has to do with the topic we sometimes call succession plans in business. Well, these are all very big implications and consequences that come from your prior decisions. Who owns the business and how do they own it? There are several different forms and ways that you can own a business. And whether or not you're talking about a very, very small business, maybe just one or two people involved in owning it, like the picture of the, looks like a bakery or some sort of a restaurant or food preparation place in the upper left-hand corner, or whether it's this huge board meeting or this company meeting for a large multinational corporation in New York is what it looks like. No matter the size of the company, you're really talking about the same kinds of considerations. There are generally three main forms of business ownership in the United States. There is the sole proprietorship, there is a partnership, and there is the corporation. These are three very familiar ways to own a business in the United States, and we'll talk about each of these in greater detail in subsequent lectures. But this is then to give you sort of an introduction to the topic as we begin to consider who owns the business and what mode or how have they structured that they own the business. Each of the different ways of business ownership will have implications on all of those prior questions we asked in those other slides. So buckle in. We're going to dive into Chapter 3. I hope this has been useful to you. We'll see you in the next lecture.